A lot of you look familiar, but there are definitely some new faces in the crowd, and I'm excited to see that. My name's Dulcie. If you haven't met me before, I'm the Executive Director of the Lake County Historical Society. Maybe you've been to the McConnell Mansion before or been to our archives. We're really excited to have Vern here with us this evening, all the way from Troy and from the 1800s. So time traveled a little bit for us this evening. We have Vern speaking tonight to raise awareness of the Waterways exhibit that is coming to Moscow next month. It is a Smithsonian traveling exhibit about the relationship that people have with water, and it's a multifaceted relationship, as I'm sure you can attest to. And one of the big stories when it comes to water in America is that it facilitated so much exploration. So tonight, Vern's going to tell us a little bit about Lewis and Clark's travels along the Snake and Upper Columbia. Vern is a member of the Hog Heaven Muzzleloaders. So if you have ever been to our ice cream social before, you will have seen Vern there. But he participates in rendezvous and lots of reenactments. So after the presentation is done, I really encourage you to come up and ask Vern some more questions about his many talents. Before you all got here, he was telling Jessica and I about how you tan leather. So not an easy process. He says it's simple, and I think simple for you maybe. For me, I would mess it up somehow. But thank you so much, Vern.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you, folks, for all for coming. I'm actually going to talk about the whole journey. It'll kind of be a little speed run on it, but the whole journey was because of the water. And that at that time, the water was the highways of the United States and future United States. So I was going to go ahead and start with President Jefferson and his vision to look over the new land that he had purchased. And he had a vision of connecting a travel way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And through the waterways, he thought that that would be possible, because other than that, all the goods in the United States had to go around South America. And so his vision was to make a connection with the rivers on North America. So he selected Captain Lewis as his commander for this expedition. And he, confident in him that all his visions would be put into Lewis. And Lewis grabbed hold of him wholeheartedly. And so he got together, started putting together all his gear, everything that he thought he might need. He selected a friend of his, which was also a fellow officer, and had been his commanding officer at one time during the Indian Wars, William Clark. And so together, they put together what gear they needed. Lewis went to Dr. Rush and learned about all these medicines, the most modern medicines that were being used. He went to all the mathematicians that he could find to learn how to calculate the stars, to see where they were at on the Earth, GPS themselves, as it were. And Clark bought into all this also. Clark, he was just as well adversed at this as was Lewis. And so they put together their plan. Jefferson had Congress appropriate $2,500 towards the expedition. Yeah, it was slightly short. By the time they got back, it was 30 grand. A little overrun. But so they got a little bit of money to start with. They went to the United States New Arsenal, which was at Harper's Ferry, and they got a lot of their gear, some tomahawks, knives, all the metal stuff that they needed for their expedition. They bought a keel boat, 55-foot long boat, as you can see here. They referred to it a lot of times as their barge. It weighed about 8 tons and had 8 tons worth of gear on it. And when it was built on the Ohio River. So they left there with a few of the men that they had acquired through the military outposts there, and started down the Ohio. Well, at that time of the year, the water is very low. A couple times they had to have a farmer pull the boat down the river. It was so low. And so it got that done. It cost them $1. So it wasn't too expensive there, but they made it all the way down the Ohio. They picked up 9 young men from Kentucky around Clarksville. They picked up men at Kaskaskia, Fort Kaskaskia, on the southern end of Illinois. And they all converged at Fort Wood for the winter of 1803 and 4. And there, Clark was in charge. Clark and Ordway were basically in charge of putting those men into a military unit. And it was kind of rough because some of the guys had never been in the military. Some of them had been. And so they worked at that, and it was fairly successful. And out of that come the 9 young men from Kentucky. 2 of those men were made sergeants and were part of the squad. So that tells you that the men that Clark had picked from Kentucky were very high quality. Lewis spent a lot of his time in St. Louis acquiring more goods, acquiring information. The Missouri was mapped up as far as the Knife River villages. They knew what it was like to get to that point. So in the spring of 1804, they pushed off into the Mississippi, floated down, and then from there it was 55 men pulling 16 tons of boat, the barge, plus the 2 pirogues up the river for 7 months. They worked at that. And they got all their gear and everything up to the Knife River villages, there where the Mandans are. And the Mandans were very, very friendly. They were quite an organized bunch of Native Americans. They were more civilized, as what the white people would consider civilized, than any other tribe that they ever run into. They farmed, they kept their villages pretty much like the housing that they do in the East. And so when they stayed there with the Mandans, it was a very friendly camp. And they built Fort, pulled a blank there, Mandan, and at that time it was right on the edge of the river. And they went ahead and fortified that up. They would never let any Indians into the fort after dark. And they always camped across the river from a Native American village. That way they didn't have the temptation of the Native Americans to seek all this newfangled gear that they were carrying. And everything they were carrying was pretty much state-of-the-art. Their rifles were state-of-the-art that they had, and so they were pretty much, high-tech as far as 1804. And so they had a pretty good winter there. They did a lot of trading. They traded for a lot of corn with the Mandans. They had a stove that was inside the keel boat that Shields ended up taking apart after it burned out and wouldn't hold fire much anymore. He fabricated that into these fighting tomahawks, and they were really sought after by the Mandans, and so they could get just about anything they wanted there. Also at Fort Mandan, they picked up their interpreter. Charbonneau was not their first choice. He was the second choice. The first, I can't recall the first man's name, but he pretty much priced himself out, and so they went ahead and went with Charbonneau. And he had with him a young wife, who was very much pregnant when they signed him on. I think they signed him on in December. And Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau was born in February. And so at that point there in the spring, they built 6 canoes to go up the river. The reason they did that is they sent their keelboat back. Everything that they had acquired scientifically, prairie dogs, any birds, any plants, anything that they considered new that was not in the eastern cities, was all collected. Jefferson wanted to know about everything. So they collected all that. They sent that back. Corporal Worthington took the keelboat and all the rest of the gear. That left 32 men in the expedition, plus an interpreter, his wife, and a baby. So that's what they left Fort Mandan with. And they worked their way up the river, Missouri, up to the Great Falls. At the Great Falls, they had a little bit of a dilemma. They got up to where the Marias River comes in. The Marias River, at that point, looked about equal to the Missouri. And so they were really at a quandary as to which fork to take. And the Marias run the same color as the Missouri. There's a lot of clay and it's really dark. But the left fork was clear. And so they were really, more than half the men wanted to take the murky water river. And they decided that they would go ahead and take the clear side. And when it was about 3 or 4 days later, they actually come on to the Great Falls. They knew the Great Falls were there. The Mandans had told them that they were there and that they would be pretty much an impasse for their flotation. So they went ahead and went up to where the Belt River comes in there, just below the falls. And they had already cached their red Perot right there at the Marias where it come in. They put it up what they thought was out of the high water and covered it up so it wouldn't be bothered. And then the white Perot went on up, and it was taken out at the Belt River and cached there, along with about half their goods that they had. They put a cache is they dig a hole in the ground, usually about so deep, and every time you'd make a cache, you'd take and put all your stuff on a blanket or piece of canvas and you'd haul it off. You didn't want any evidence that the ground had been disturbed there. So they would take all this debris from this hole and haul it off. They would line this pit with usually with sticks or something to keep the moisture up off of it, and then they would throw all their gear down in there. And they put everything in there. They put barrels of pork in there. They had extra clothes. They had extra guns. They had all kinds of stuff that couldn't go any further because of the amount of gear that they were going to have to carry just in the canoes. And since they had the falls there, they did a portage. What they did, they made these carriages out of cottonwood. And they drug these canoes up onto these carriages, and those 6 canoes were pulled across the prairie 14 miles to a place on the other side that they call Canoe Camp. And at that point, they they were about ready to get back into the water. They built 3 more canoes, so now they have 9. They also had some of their gear that they figured would go in this experimental boat that Lewis had designed and made up at Harper's Ferry. It was strips of metal framework that was about 3/4 the size of one of those pirogues. So probably 30 to 35 feet long and probably 6 feet wide. His idea was to put together this frame. It just bolted together, and it was just thin strips. And his plan was to go ahead and get enough hides. So they had buffalo hide, they had elk hide, and they stitched this all together. And it was looking great. The only thing they didn't have was pitch. All the trees around there are deciduous. They're all leaf trees, so they couldn't find any pitch. So they figured, well, what we'll do is we'll take buffalo tallow and we'll take some of the wax from our candles and we'll make this paste and we'll put it on there, on these seams to try and seal it. Well, it worked really good until it got in the water, and then the wax hardened and the thing just sunk. And it was out there about 15 minutes and down it went. And Lewis he was really despondent about having this magnificent piece, and all of a sudden it is no good. So now they have to cache the other part of their goods that they hauled across the prairie, and because they don't have enough canoes to haul it all. So they get back into their canoes and up the river they go, and they're headed west, and they get up to a place called Three Forks, Montana, in there. And it's where the Jefferson, the Madison, and the Gallatin all come together. And it's in a real marshy area, and they're just snaking around. And it's really hard to tell who's who, where's where, and what. But what they do is they take the most northern fork, which is the Jefferson. And they go ahead and pull their canoes up through the Jefferson. The Jefferson goes up and it'll fork again. And at this point, Sacagawea recognizes where she is. And so the fork that they take is called the Beaver Head. And if anybody's ever been up there, there's actually a big ridge up there that looks like a beaver is just crouched down on the ground. And that's why it's called that. It's called the Beaver Head. And so she is really invaluable now because she's been on this when she was a child and remembers the way that, because that's where her folks would go to hunt and collect things needed for their survival. The only thing is, the Beaver Head is still within the warring tribe, the Blackfeet, and which was really hard on the Shoshones. And so they go ahead and take the Beaver Head, and the Beaver Head goes up until it comes to where Red Rock Creek comes in and Horse Prairie Creek. Neither one of those are big enough to float anything. They were having trouble getting up the Beaver Head towards the end anyway. There's a funny little story there on one where one of the canoes got loose and it swung in the river there, knocked White House down and went right over the top of him. They thought that it had crushed him, but he survived, got up and got back up and was able to work with it. But so they worked their tails off getting up the river and get to that point, and now what do? They knew that the Mandans had said that the Shoshones will have horses, and Sacagawea knew that they were horse people. And so at that point, the water ceased to be their conveyance. All their gear now was going to have to go overland or be packed to the Columbia side. See, they had maps also up the Columbia River to about where the tidewater is, about where Bonneville Dam is now. They had maps up that far. It's been mapped in there since the late 1700s. So they knew that that part was there, but anything from there to the Mandans was just a big guess. So they went ahead and they split up. Lewis split off himself and 3 other guys. They followed, and Clark would have went. It was his turn to go on the 4A, but he was in such pain with his feet. The prickly pear had infected his feet so bad that he couldn't hardly walk. He was riding most of the time. So he was unable to go. So Lewis took the 3 guys and followed Horse Prairie all the way up to where it just petered out and become a spring. And McNeil made a statement that he was able to stand with 1 foot on one side and 1 on the other of the Missouri River. And they also went up and found this spring. They drank from that spring up on top of Lemhi Pass there, just down from the top. And then when they did go up onto the top to look over, Lewis's heart sank again, because as Jefferson had kind of explained and envisioned, we'd have a slow rise up to the crest and a gentle rise down off the other side. Well, when he looked over and seen what's Idaho, he said it was the most tremendous mountains he'd ever seen. He said he had no way. He hadn't even made contact with the Shoshones yet. He had no way of getting over these snowy mountains. He was just terrified. He thought it was the end. He'd satisfied one part of Jefferson's thoughts, was to follow the Missouri to its source, which he did. And so then he went ahead and followed the drainage down off the other side, and down off the other side, about the same elevation down from the top, is another spring that feeds out to the Pacific. And I've been up there. I've drank out of both, and the west side is much sweeter. So he met 3 women down off the pass. He ran into 3 women down there. One was an older lady and a younger woman with a child. The younger woman with the child, they both ran as soon as they seen him. He was calling to them, trying to be friendly, but the older woman, she just cowered. She thought she was going to die. And he went up, comfort her, give her some goods to take back to the village. And before she made it back to the village, the Shoshones were already coming out. And so Lewis did a very good job of befriending him. He gave him everything he had to, appease them. And he got in their good graces. And they took him to the village, and where they went ahead and fed him up. They just finished the last of their flour and berries that they had. They made a little paste, and that was it. The hunting up on that pass was pretty poor, so they made it to the village. At the village there, like I say, they fed them. They made plans. They went back over the divide down to the party. Okay, now the party is already up there and camped at what they call Camp Fortunate. And at that point, a lot of their gear was made for canoes, but not for horses. So what they did is they took and they went from paddles to saddles. And what this is a kind of a replica of what they would have done. They cut their paddle blades off. They used the upper shafts to build their pack saddles. This in here is I've just crudely put it together with the rawhide. They'd have probably rawhided them a lot tighter to where it wasn't quite as flexible. And so they were breaking their boxes down to make their saddles. They were using their paddles, and that's what they used. Plus, the women of the Shoshones carried a lot of their gear. over the pass with them. But they brought the horses and made it back over to about around Salmon, where Salmon is, where the Lemhi and the Salmon River come together. Is where their camp was. They stayed there for quite a few days. Actually, their stay in Idaho was about 108 days total. And out of that camp, Clark did a foray down below the North Fork, where it comes in about 20 miles. And the Shoshones had told him that the rocks are so huge and it's just so rough of water, you could never get a craft through it. And after he made his trip down there, he said, yeah. And so he come back, they started trading for horses. They ended up with about 32, 33 horses, some of them so poor that they could hardly carry anything. They were kind of in a tough spot, and they was getting as much out of their gear as they could, but their horses weren't as good a shape as some of the other tribes. So they got their horses up over the pass. They went, lost trail, back into Montana and down the Bitterroot Valley. At the end of down at the Bitterroot Valley, where the Lolo Creek comes in, right where the highway comes in, right there, they had a camp. That camp there is one of the only camps that's actually been verified as a camp of Lewis and Clark. The reason being, they had a latrine. The latrines were supposed to be 90 feet from the camp. Well, they found some camp where campfires were. They verified that by the lead that they found around the campfire. See, lead has a molecular signature from any mine around. And so if you know what that is, you know where it comes from. And that lead was tested, and it tested up to be out of Pennsylvania. And that's where a lot of their lead was mined and made up, was there. So that's how they verified that camp. Plus, the latrine, they'd been feeding the men these Russia's pills. Russia's pills had a lot of mercury in them. And so the mercury doesn't really digest, it just kind of flows through. And so in this pit, they found mercury. So that's one of the ways they actually verified the Travelers Rest camp. So after they had camped there for a few days to rest, they back up the Lolo River, or Lolo Creek. Actually, the trail breaks off a little, goes over the pass, and goes behind where the visitor center is up there, and comes into what's called Glade Creek. Their description of Glade Creek is so vivid, you can go there today and tell what it looks like. And because they talked about the sandy bottom and a few other things there. That takes up and with them they had their Shoshone guide and his son, and he takes them down to this fishery, which is down on the Locksaw, the tail end of where the Locksaw comes up. Shotgun Creek comes down through there and mixes with that. But he knew where that was, but because that's where they'd come to catch the salmon. But he wasn't exactly sure. He knew where the trail was, but he knew it was up on the ridge. You couldn't follow the river. So back up onto the ridge they go. And this trip, this 90-mile trip that they make from that point to the Weippe Prairie is one of the toughest sections of the Lewis and Clark Trail. Their weather was rough. The trail is very rocky and stony. In 1998, Dave Benson and I made that trip on horseback. There was 5 of us. We rode horses from Shotgun Creek up the pass to Papoose Saddle, and then mostly the mostly the road, the 500 road out. And we did some little off the side pieces to the trail, the Nez Perce Trail. And when we got down past Weedus Creek there, we had some incidents like Lewis and Clark had. When Lewis and Clark come down, they went down off that ridge on a trail, and it comes down onto what's called Hungry Creek. They've renamed it. It used to be Fish Creek, but they renamed it to Hungry Creek again. And at that point, they come down, and one of their horses stepped off the trail, rolled 100 yards down in this steep bank into this creek. They figure the horse was dead. They go down, and they pull the gear off the horse, and the horse gets up, and within 20 minutes, they've got the pack back on the horse, and it's moving again. Our situation was a little different than that. We come down this 245 trail, which comes down along Gas Creek, which is named after Sergeant Gass, and we broke down into the creek. We come up the other side, and when we come up the other side, the last guy was pulling his horse up, leading it up through there. It come around the corner, and it's probably 15 feet up off the creek there. The horse rears back, flips over backwards, and rolls down into the creek. And it's just laying there. And so Fox runs down there, and he grabs the horse's head to pull it up out of the water. And he's sitting there holding it and, figures it's dead. What are we going to do with this now? Pretty soon the horse comes to and gets up. And so when it gets up, Fox had pulled his shoulder trying to hold on to it. And the horse gets up and just takes off back to the opposite side of where we're going. So up the trail it goes, and by then it's getting kind of dark. The weather's turning crappy. It's starting to thunder. And we're about, we were probably up about 75 yards up off the creek there. We found a little bench where we were going to camp. Well, the horse gets over there, and we can hear this horse whinnying. And all night you can hear it whinnying, and the other horses kind of talking back to it. And so we figured, well, the horse didn't go too far. And so we make it through the night. Up the next morning, this Ken, he takes off and takes on his mule, goes over there. And the horse had run up there and straddled a pine tree. And the pine tree had popped up and caught it on its britchin, where it goes around its rear end there. And it just stood there all night. And so we led it back over, and heck, we ended up walking them out that day because it was so steep we couldn't. We were at a point where we were kind of lost anyway. It didn't really look familiar what I was expecting on the map. We could hear some guys across over there doing some archery hunting, but how to get there, we had no clue. And so I said, well, I know the road is north. So we make kind of a big sachet and get up onto the road and back down and make a camp down just about where Windy Saddle peels off there. But Lewis and Clark, their trail actually went, from what I've looked up now, went up over this ridge and dropped down into, a place that they called Artichoke Camp, and then up over that and out. And they make it down, and they come out onto the prairie. And Lewis and Clark, they split up on the 18th. Clark splits off from Lewis of the main party. They end up being Clark goes out with 6 men, and they come out onto the prairie on the 20th. And at that point is when Clark meets the three little boys. One boy gets away. 2 of them, he goes over and hides in the brush, and he finds them, gives them some trinkets, some ribbon, and they go back to the camp. Well, the camp elders come out. They find out later that the camp, most of the warriors had left about 3 days earlier, and were going to be gone about 18 days on this warring party. And so all that's left in the camp is old women, old men, and kids. And so they feed them. one of the men is sent back with a horse to give to Lewis, and well, Clark had killed a horse prior to that and hung it up for the rest of the party coming in. They were running really low on food, and so they were in rough shape. But they all make it out to the prairie. Clark is surveying the river, what they call the Coos Key, which is a clear water. And Clark, the first time he sees it, he knows that that is the same river that he was on when he was up at that fishery with the guide had taken him down to. He knew that that was the same river, which was kind of surprising to me, but being that far away and up over the ridge and such. But so they go ahead and they get down to the camp, down and start putting together canoe camp. Most of the men are very sick. The Nez Perce fed them camas, they fed them salmon, and fed them some berries. Well, the camas, when they make it up, they bake it in the ground in these pit ovens, and it looks like a little onion when you harvest it. It's white and kind of flaky, but when you bake it like that, it comes out just a dark brown, and it tastes like a sorghum. It's really, really sweet. And so the men being in their condition, I mean, being hungry, I mean, they just gorged themselves on this stuff. Well, as Lewis put it, it creates great wind. And so they were just bound up like you wouldn't believe. In fact, they said there was guys laying alongside the trail, and Lewis, he couldn't even ride a gentle horse. So, but they get down to the canoe camp, and at canoe camp, they split up into 5 squads, and they all pick trees that are down on this flat. All the trees that they've seen before were very small, and on this flat there's trees that are big enough to, they think, to make canoes out of. There's one fella that talked to one of our fellow club members, muzzleloader club members, that remembers when he was a kid, before they moved the road. And he said he remembers the old-timers talking about this stump. It was a big pitch stump. He said it was pretty enormous, really. And he said that everybody called that the Lewis and Clark tree. And so I always thought that was kind of interesting, as to that he actually had seen where these were taken from. But it tells that some of them were out on the edge of the bank. Some of them have to be hauled to the river. So they ended up making 5 different canoes, and the men's being in such a rough way, they ended up trying to burn them out the Indian way. We ended up, our club ended up making 17 of these dugouts. The first 2 were made in 97, and then the rest of them all through the bicentennial. We made one from scratch at canoe camp when we did a reenactment there, and made one right from scratch, all within about 3 days. So, and we didn't burn any of it. So it actually, you got the right stuff, goes pretty fast. But Lewis and Clark got all their canoes ready, and on the 7th of October, they're all ready to go. At that point, what they did is they had 38 horses, and what they did is they branded them all. And when they branded them, they said that they used a stirrup iron. Now, Lewis had with him this iron, which is in Oregon State Historical Society, has this in their archives, and this is an exact replica of it. It's a bronze replica. But some guys say that this would have been too harsh on the horses. But I don't know what else they would have used if they, this brand was known to have been in their possession. It was a stirrup brand, which is built like this, so that no matter which way you put it on, it gives equal pressure. And then the original was actually found in about 1877 upriver from Portland on an island. That's where the original was found. So whether it was traded off, lost, don't know. But so they branded them and cut the horses' forelocks on the manes so that they knew which horses were theirs, and give those to the Nez Perce to take care of. They also, one of the guys was trading for some otter hides to make caps. And the only thing that I can think of on their caps would have been used, the river otters, is to make what we call today a Canadian cap. And it just it's a blanket cap with a fur around the outside edge, and which was pretty popular during the day. And so that's my guess is what he was talking about there. They also dug a cache and cached all their saddles. They talk about that right on the bend below the camp. Well, as the highway comes in there, the river comes down and makes a tight little bend right there. And so my guess is that's right where they build the cache. And so they put in the cache the saddles and some of their ammunition they put in there. And they're pretty much ready to go. They load up. Their first day, they make it down to where Lenore is. And if you look at the journals, Clark is sitting there mapping each bend. And he hits it by about a half a mile. I mean, he's almost right on with just sitting there watching the landscape go by. I can understand how you can do it walking, but how do you do it riding on the water? It just, kind of flabbergasts me that they can do that. They get down there and they bury 2 canisters of powder. The powder that they had were made up into lead containers. Okay, this lead container here is a replica that I built up. It weighs 8 pounds, holds 4 pounds of powder. That was calculated out to be equivalent to what the new weapons that Lewis had got at the arsenal. And so these are what they cache. And when that horse rolled down into that river, he was packing 2 packs of these. So there'd been 9 of these on each side of that horse, about 90 pounds, so probably around close to 140 pounds worth of weight that the horse rolled down the bank with. Now this is what, there was a plumber in Pennsylvania that made these up for Lewis. And that's how they figured that in Pennsylvania, that's where the lead came from, and so that's how they tracked it back. And figured that was probably how part of that camp was, there at Traveler's Rest. Also, when they, after they left that camp, they went down and had an incident where the canoe that Sergeant Gass was riding in hits a rock right about where Coulter's Creek comes in, or Potlatch Creek comes in. At that point, the canoe filled with water, all the gear was wet, some of the beds were floating off, and so they had one of the Indians, there was a big camp right there. It used to be called Turkey Island, where that come down. There was a little jettison that went around that part, and it was called Turkey Island. Now it's a spot where the DOT for Idaho sets all their gear up and stuff. And so that's where the camp was. And so they come out and they helped them get the canoe in. They ended up taking all the gear out, laying it out, trying to protect it from all the natives that were interested. They handed out a few medals at that place, these medals here that I have are all replicas of the sizes that they were handing out. This one here is an actual silver medal that is made up and made in the same fashion as those medals were. Now, this medal here of this size was owned by WSU at one time, which was found on a dig down where the Palouse River comes in, which was called Druyer's River, but for George Druyer of the expedition. He and that medal was on display for quite a while there at Nez Perce, or at Nez Perce Historical Society, or spot there, and then during the bicentennial they took it off. I think it was given to the Nez Perce, and when it was given to them, I think they pulled it for a viewing item. They did have this along with a piece of ribbon that they thought was from that era. But in all, my count of the medals that were given out were 77 medals, from what I read in the journals, what I could come up with. There was only 10 of the large ones that were actually made. One of them they packed all the way to the Pacific coast and back, and was going to be given to Big White at the Mandan village on the return. So after they get everything dried out there, they proceed on down, and on the 10th of October, they get down to the confluence of the Clearwater and Lewis's River, or the Snake River. They make a comment that the Lewis's River is a greenish blue color, and that's really the only observation they make. They proceed down to the Columbia, and there's one incident just before they get to the Columbia that they have one canoe. They're always hitting rocks, but in the rapids, but this one canoe comes dead fast right on a rapid. And so the men step out of the canoe and get it unloaded and step out of the canoe, and the canoe takes off. So here they are, 4 of these guys standing up to their knees in the water with no way to get out of the river. So they end up, there was some Indian canoes that come up and helped them out, and Sergeant Ordway was in that canoe when it actually took off. But so that's when they make it to the Columbia River. And that's as far as I was going to go as far as the trip going out. Coming back, I was going to talk a little bit about them coming back into the country. They got back in 1806, May 4th. They come down Alpower Grade, cross the river, about 3 miles up from where that creek comes in, and made their way back up. When they got up to where, because the Indians had said it was a lot better road on the north side of the river. So they spend a little time at Coulter's River again. There's a comment about they have a large fishery there. So they must have had some big salmon traps just upriver from where that comes in. They cross the river, go over to where Lawyer's Creek is, down Lawyer's Creek. When they get to Lawyer's Creek, one of the chiefs has a flag that was given to him that was flying above his camp. They had 2 flags. They had this flag that was that they were handing out, and they also had the 15 star, 15 stripe. Well, this has got the 15 stripes, but the field was changed a little bit, on it. And I always thought this was kind of an interesting flag. They also had one that they packed on their pirogue, or their keelboat, that was a little different too. They made their camp there at Camp Choppinish. Actually, where that camp was at, it's across the river from Kamiah. There's a mill there now. In '89, I went and talked to the folks there at the mill. They allowed me to go out into the yard and look at that. And there wasn't really anything. It had all been dozed over. They talked about some pit houses that they stayed in while they were there. And but yeah, it had all been scraped off, and I don't think there was anything actually there left that would have resembled, what Lewis and Clark would have seen. But they they made a canoe there, which was their last canoe that they made. No, it wasn't either the last canoe that they made, because they made two on the Yellowstone that they catamaraned. But they made one canoe there, lasted one day. They made this 27-foot canoe. They put it in the river. The men went across, started across the river. They got to the bank. The bank was real brushy, and it kind of pinned them a little bit. Well, the current was running so high because of runoff. This was in the 28th or 29th of May, and it just pushed it into the bank, flipped it up, and dumped everything out. They lost 3 blankets like this. All the blankets that I can tell that they were carrying were white blankets, because they referred to a horse that was as white as the blanket. And so Lewis considered this a very serious loss, because some of the men only had just one blanket. And losing those blankets were pretty serious. They still had to cross the mountains, and they had a long ways to go. They were carrying some robes, but and they also had a capote. I don't know if a lot of you know what a capote is, but it's a blanket coat. It's a coat actually made out of the blanket, and so that was lost also. So they left that camp, and the only other incident that I actually have a deal for was they were gigging fish up on El Dorado Creek, and they could see the fish in there, but they had no way to get them out. So they were using their bayonets. They fixed their bayonets to poles and were stabbing the fish with their bayonets. So, also Ordway had made a side trip to the Snake River. On the 27th of May, he left, and they went up, and it's kind of interesting because when they got down to the camp close there was an Indian woman there that had 2 Spanish dollars, and Frasier was so intrigued by that he traded her an old razor of this style for the 2 Spanish dollars. And they talked about a few different times where they picked up Spanish pieces. Lewis picked up a Spanish bit when he was with the Shoshones, and so there was a lot of interaction coming out of the South. A lot of the Shoshones were doing some interaction with the Spanish down there, but they weren't getting a lot of horses. The Nez Perce, they picked up most of their horses from the Shoshones. So where they were letting the Shoshones bring them up and snatching them on the way by. So that's how they build up their herd. But well, that's about that's not the whole story, but we're about out of time. So so does anybody have any questions about anything?
Yeah. How did you get excited to be a part of this? What drew you in to be so realistic about the Corps of Discovery? How did that happen in your life?
Well, it was due kind of to the muzzleloader club. I've always been interested in history, even when I was a young guy. I got my first muzzleloader when I was still in high school. Started my rendezvous going in '78. Went down to the wife's sister's place, stayed there, and went to my first rendezvous there. And then in '97, this Lewis and Clark experience come to Lewiston, and our group was kind of more of a buckskinning style group as a muzzleloader group, and so I figured we were going to get sucked into this thing anyway. So I figured, well, we might as well make this a fun event, and so that's where I bought the first log that we built the first canoe out of, and the second log that we built the canoe out of down there was one that nobody had purchased, and so they went ahead and let us go ahead and finish it out for that event, and that got us started on the dugouts, and so we become the dugout specialists, I guess, and we started. The biggest one we ever made was like a 35-footer. Made them out of cottonwood. A friend of mine and I, we went to Twin Bridges, Montana, and it was a half a canoe. They wanted half of it carved out, the front half carved out, but the back left as a log for their county fairs, and so yeah, we ended up making about 17 of them. So, yes.
Do you know when they were returning, if it's true they met people already coming up from St. Louis, like trappers and explorers?
Yeah, Dixon and Hancock were a couple of trappers that were coming upriver to do some trapping, and John Coulter requested to be relieved of duty from the Corps, and he joined them and went back in and acted as their guide, and yeah. And then later on in the fur trade, George Drewer ends up in there. Potts. There's a lot of the men ended up coming back in for the fur trade. So, yeah.
Did their caches survive, or did they? I mean, did they find them?
I know they pulled. They talk about pulling the caches. The cache at Canoe Camp washed out. They lost about half their saddles. Lewis's saddle was lost too, so he must have had a riding saddle. Because I wouldn't have thought you'd ride anything like that. So, but yeah, half those. As far as I know, they were most all those canisters that were buried there at Lenore. They were returned to Clark the next year. The Indian that returned them said, "Well, my dog dug them up." So they returned them, and they give him a knife and a piece of tobacco, I believe, is what he received for his being so honest. And that's one thing they talked about the Nez Perce. They were really honest about everything. So, but yes.
There were, if I remember correctly, there were reports of air rifles or using compression air rifles.
There was one air rifle. It was a Garadoni. It was an Austrian-made gun. Shot 21 rounds, about 41 caliber. The stock was the air chamber in it. One of our club members actually owns one, but it's on loan to the Mandan Museum right now. But you could put 21 rounds in there, and it had a spring-loaded block on it, and you just push it sideways, and it load it in. You pull the hammer back and pop it out of there, slide another one, and It's said that it doesn't actually look like this, but it was said that they could put like 800 pounds of pressure inside that chamber, which is, I would consider a bomb, but I mean, how in the heck, you know, I mean, they didn't solder anything, it was all riveted. So, but yeah, it's a neat little piece. There's only about 3 of them still existing.
So what are the indications in terms of using it for hunting or lethality?
They used it mainly to mystify the Indians, primarily. There was one guy that was, before they left on the expedition, was holding it back. I'm not sure which city they were in, and discharged the gun, and it caught a woman right alongside the temple. And it left a crease and knocked her out, but it didn't kill her. But that air rifle had enough power that it could push a ball right through a pine board, a 1-inch pine board. So there was significant power to it, but it never did catch on with the Austrian army. They made, you know, about 300 or 400 of these things, but you know, I mean, you don't hear about them being really used anywhere. But
So maybe, do we have one more question? Do you have a question? No? Okay, I thought you were raising your hand. One more question?
Do you know if there is any exploring or any excavating or any of the sites where they thought they might be going on now, or is it pretty much completed?
I don't think there's anything going on now. They were trying to do some ground penetrating stuff, I know, up around Mandan, but the way the river changed there, I think it washed that site where that was at right into the river. They tried to do some out at Clatsop, but one of the issues they had out there is that there was a lot of trees, and there was a farmer, when he come in there and was going to farm it, he would cut the trees and then burn them. Well, all these burnt roots look like a fire. So you got what looks like campfires all over the place. So that one is, you know, they're not sure where that one is either. But as far as any others, I'm not aware of any others at the moment.
Well, thank you so much, Vern, again, for joining us tonight. I'm sure if there's a few outstanding questions, Vern would be happy to chat and definitely come up and take a look at some of these artifacts before you leave. And my last reminder for you is please grab one of these on your way out. This will give you the dates for our future evening lectures, as well as some information about the opening reception of the Smithsonian exhibit, which is next month, December 9th. But thank you all for being here, and thank you, Vern.